So thank you all so much for taking the time to join us today. My name is Tanya DeSosa. I am a member of the APT team conducting the evaluation of MTW Flexibility Cohort. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Larry Buron and Judy Geyer, who will be presenting with me as well today. We also have some members from HUD on the webinar today, including our evaluation representative, Ann Fletcher. Ann, would you like to say hello?
Hey everyone, thank you, Tanya. I just wanted to say hello on behalf of HUD and thank you all so much on behalf of the Office of Policy Development and Research within HUD that's sponsoring the evaluation and our partners in the MTW Program Office. Thank you so much for your continued participation in the evaluation. We're really looking forward to the discussion during the webinar today and answering any questions you all might have afterwards. So thanks again, both for being part of the evaluation and for joining today.
Thanks, Ann. So we're going to start the presentation today with an overview of the evaluation and describe how the study samples were selected. We're then going to discuss the motivations that drove many of you to apply for MTW based on our review of your applications, your MTW plans, and our interviews with you and your staff. We'll then present the outcome measures that will be used in all the reports that we prepare for HUD. Finally, we'll discuss next steps for the evaluation and open it up for questions. We'll also be conducting a poll at the end to ask you about topics that you'd be interested in learning more about from your MTW peers. So please keep that in the back of your mind during the presentation today so you can provide some input later about what you'd be most interested in hearing about from your peers. Okay, so as I mentioned today, I'm going to pass it over to Larry Buron, who is going to provide the evaluation overview.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Tanya. We will start with the evaluation overview. I know everyone on the call knows the MTW program, so I'm just going to give some brief background to orient us as to where the MTW agencies in this cohort fit in. In 2016, there were 39 MTW PHAs, and Congress authorized HUD to add another 100 agencies. Of the 100 new PHAs, at least 50 had to have less than 1,000 combined units, and there had to be a rigorous evaluation of the activities implemented by the expansion MTW agencies. That was the congressional direction. HUD decided to meet these goals by adding MTW agencies in cohorts, with each cohort testing a different policy change. This cohort, what we call the flexibility cohort, is testing full MTW flexibility for smaller PHAs. So this is a study of the first cohort of the MTW expansion and will address how smaller PHAs implement MTW and the impact on PHAs and tenets of MTW. Next slide. Oh yeah, you're ahead of me. This slide addresses what is specifically interesting about study of MTW at smaller PHAs. First, all PHAs in the flexibility cohort are smaller, as are most PHAs in the US, but only one current MTW PHA has less than 1,000 combined units. So this is the first opportunity to learn about how smaller PHAs use MTW flexibility and how it impacts the PHA and its tenants. Second, the GAO study found that small PHAs are less cost-effective than large PHAs. One of the MTW objectives is cost effectiveness, so it will be useful to learn what waivers that small PHAs use to increase cost effectiveness and whether MTW has an impact on cost effectiveness. Third, smaller PHAs have fewer staff than larger PHAs, so it'll be interesting to learn how much change can the smaller PHAs manage. How many activities can you undertake? Will the activities be at a particular PHA be focused on one objective or spread across objectives? Will you make just tweaks or will major changes be made? And how many PHAs will make major changes? Next, we're going to talk about the evaluation approach. This evaluation has both a process study and an impact study. So you can see on the slide that the process study will address the question, how do smaller PHAs use their flexibility? What do you do with MTW flexibility? Why do you do it? What challenges do you face along the way in deciding on and implementing new activities? What do you hope to achieve by implementing your activities? And this part of the study, the process study, will be primarily based on what you report in the MTW supplement and interviews we conduct with your staff. The impact study will address the question of what are the impacts of MTW on smaller PHAs and their tenants. This will be addressed primarily using administrative data. Impact will be measured using an experimental and non-experimental sample, and I will talk about both of those samples in a few slides from now. The next slide goes into more detail on the data. Okay, the data sources, the process study for the baseline report, which is the report that we're working on right now and which will be published soon, is based on the MTW application survey and interviews we conducted with you in March. Future reports, which we call future annual reports, will be based primarily on the MTW supplement and information for interviews with you each February or March. So that's for the process study. The impact study will be primarily based on HUD administrative data. The baseline report presents the data source definitions and values of outcomes at baseline, so prior to MTW, from 2020. The future annual reports will measure impacts of MTW using these outcome measures and subsequent years' data. The FDS, the financial data system data, will be for the most recent fiscal year, and all the other administrative data will be from the most recent calendar year. The impact study will also use quarterly earnings data on individuals from the National Directory of New Hires and census tract data from the American Community Survey. Note there's a couple asterisks in the table because the 508, the new HUD 508, MTW 50058, and the MTW supplement, as the first cohort, you'll be the first user testers of these new data collection systems. Next, we'll talk about how we arrived at both our experimental and quasi-experimental samples. Okay, this slide shows how we arrived at our experimental sample using random assignment. Random assignment puts some PHAs in a treatment group that are invited to apply for MTW under the flexibility cohort, and some PHAs in a control group that cannot become MTW under the flexibility cohort. The idea of the experimental sample is that any differences in outcomes we observe in the future is caused by MTW as a designation, as the two groups are supposed to be alike, other than the treatment group is allowed to get MTW status. This definitiveness about causation of outcomes differences is the strength of an experimental design. Okay, so how did we get the experimental sample? Well, you lived this process, but I'll quickly go through the 5 steps in the timeline shown on the slide. Step 1, HUD released a selection notice in October 2018 and asked for letters of interest. HUD also asked the applicants to fill out a survey on what their priorities were for MTW and what waivers they were most interested in. The baseline report contains analysis of these survey responses. 43 PHAs that applied were determined to be eligible for the flexibility cohort. Okay, step 2. In November 2019, HUD randomly assigned 33 of the 43 PHAs to the treatment group, meaning that they were invited to fill out part 2 of the application to become an MTW agency. 10 of the 43 PHAs were assigned to the control group, meaning they were not eligible to become an MTW agency under the flexibility cohort, but are still eligible to become an MTW agency through a future cohort. The selection notice mentioned geographic diversity of MTW agencies as a goal, and to meet this goal, the same percent of PHAs were randomly assigned to the treatment group in each of the 5 regions designated in the solicitation. Step 3. 31 of the 33 treatment PHAs completed part 2 of the application by December 2020. For this part, the 31 PHAs developed a preliminary plan for how they would use MTW and had to have a public comment period on their plan. We also analyzed these plans for the baseline report. Step 4, HUD offered MTW designation to the 31 treatment PHAs that successfully completed part 2 of the application. However, a PHA is not officially designated as an MTW PHA until they sign their MTW ACC amendment. That's the next step. So step 5, as of late August of this year, 27 of the 31 flexibility cohort PHAs had signed their MTW ACC amendment. This means that 27 PHAs are officially MTW agencies, and they are eligible for funding eligibility at the start of the first month after they signed it. The next step's not shown in the graphic. This is after PHAs become an MTW agency. And the next step is for PHAs to complete the MTW supplement in order to use any of the MTW waivers. So they need to complete the MTW supplement describing their plans. And my understanding is that so far, several PHAs have started this supplement, but none have finished it. So none of the flexibility cohort PHAs are yet using any of the waivers. Next slide. In addition to the experimental design sample of treatment and control PHAs, we also added a quasi-experimental design or QED sample. We added a QED sample to have a larger comparison sample for more precise estimates of impacts and to allow subgroup analysis. 10 control PHAs is too small to do subgroup analysis. The larger comparison group will allow us to do subgroup analysis on both observable baseline characteristics, such as the size of the PHA, and for subgroups based on the main MTW activities that a PHA selected. For example, if half the PHAs focus on self-sufficiency activities, we can do an analysis on that subgroup of PHAs and their matched comparison group PHAs. To select the comparison PHAs, we aimed for an exact match on the same 5 regions where random assignment was done, an exact match on program types, that is whether it's a PHA only, HCV only, or a PHA that operates both programs. And then we aim for a closest match as possible on a bunch of other PHA and local housing market characteristics, such as PHA size, category, metro, non-metro jurisdiction, tenant characteristics such as average earnings. And we selected 3 comparison PHAs for each treatment PHA for a total of 99 comparison PHAs. So overall, the QED sample looks great on observable characteristics, looks just like the treatment group PHAs, but it is missing one thing that an experimental sample has. We don't know if it's well matched on unobservable characteristics that led to applying for MTW. Now, for example, if those who applied, the PHAs that applied, were most capable of implementing MTW activities or would benefit the most, then the findings won't necessarily apply to the small PHAs that didn't apply. So the experimental design is the strongest design, and we are treating that as the primary sample for reaching conclusions in this study. This map shows the 142 study PHAs. There's red stars for the 33 treatment PHAs, blue squares for the 10 control PHAs, and green circles for the 99 comparison PHAs. Just a couple of comments, observations while you're looking at it. There's a lot more green circles than other symbols, and that's because the comparison PHA sample is the largest group. The Mississippi River, goes just along Minnesota, down along Illinois and Missouri, is the kind of the dividing line. About half of the PHAs are west of that, half of the PHAs are east of it in the study. And the overall picture from the map is that all 3 groups of study PHAs are spread out through most of the USA, but you can see there are some gaps in the upper Midwest, in the Indiana, Ohio, Wisconsin, and in some of the northern western states. And this is just a reflection of of the PHAs that applied. So it wasn't a selection decision, it was just it was PHAs selected by who decided to apply for MTW. Okay, this slide compares the PHAs that applied for MTW under this first cohort to all PHAs that might potentially have applied, all the eligible PHAs. So there are 43 PHAs that applied for the flexibility cohort, but there's thousands of PHAs that could have applied. By our count, there was 2,065 PHAs that could have applied. So here we compare the 43 PHAs to all eligible PHAs. The purpose of this comparison is to see how well the results from these PHAs are likely to represent what would happen if all small PHAs got the flexibility associated with MTW. So I'll focus on the characteristics of, so with this table on the right, it shows we compared the eligible PHAs to the study PHAs on a bunch of different characteristics. This table here just reports on the characteristics that are pretty different. The ones that aren't different aren't shown here. So first of all, a little over half of the study PHAs have both a PHA and a HCV program. This is much higher than for eligible PHAs. For eligible PHAs, about a third of the PHAs have both programs. Most of the rest of the study PHAs, if they're not both an HCV and public house, if they don't operate both programs, most operate HCV only, and only 11.6% operate public housing only. The second major difference is the size. About 2/3 of the study PHAs have more than 500 units, and 1/3 have less than 500 units. So the study PHAs are larger than the other eligible PHAs with less than 1,000 combined units. For example, you can see that 20% of the study PHAs are have less than 250 combined units, but 60% of all eligible PHAs have less than 250 combined units. So the ones that decided to apply were larger within this smaller PHA size limit of 1,000 combined units. Third, study PHAs are also much more likely to be in a metro area and have higher rents and tenant incomes than all eligible PHAs that could have applied. For example, almost 70% of study PHAs are in metro areas compared to 7% of all eligible PHAs. So the conclusion from this comparison is the applicant PHAs are pretty different than all small eligible PHAs on observable characteristics. I'm going to turn it over to Tanya to talk about motivations for applying for this flexibility cohort.
Thanks, Larry. So as part of the process study, we conducted a round of interviews with many of you, the flexibility cohort PHAs, in March of this year. During those interviews, we asked you about which factors help motivate you to apply for MTW designation. We also surveyed many of the PHAs who applied for the flexibility cohort but were assigned to the control group. The most common motivators for applying to MTW were having colleagues at existing PHAs that were part of the legacy or initial MTW cohort that encouraged you to apply for designation under this expansion cohort. Excitement about new opportunities for programmatic innovation and the desire for more funding flexibility. Using MTW to reduce administrative burden was one of the most frequent goals driving many of you to apply. In part 2 of the MTW application, and during our interviews with many of you, we reviewed which of the MTW waivers PHAs in the flexibility cohort are thinking about implementing. So most of you were still working out the details for which waivers will be pursued and how. But all of you reported an interest in pursuing MTW waivers to adjust your reexamination policies, such as adjusting your reexamination schedule to occur less frequently or allowing tenants to self-certify their assets. And 90% were interested in planning to adjust tenant rent policies. So planned activities under the tenant rent policy waivers varied from making small changes such as adjusting your utility allowances to major changes like switching to a stepped rent policy. These two waivers are expected to help reduce administrative burden on staff, improve cost effectiveness, and in some cases increase tenant self-sufficiency. Over 2/3 of flexibility cohort PHAs are planning to use landlord leasing incentives to increase housing choice for tenants. These include offering damage claims to landlords if a tenant leaves a unit in need of repairs, providing landlords with vacancy loss payments to encourage their continued participation in the HCV program, and providing signing bonuses, for example, a month's rent to encourage new landlords to begin participating in the HCV program. Slightly more than half of our flexibility cohort PHAs are planning to foster self-sufficiency by implementing work requirements for non-elderly, non-disabled tenants, age 18 or older. We compared flexibility cohort PHA's planned use of waivers to those identified during part one of the MTW application. So when you filled out that longer baseline survey, there were some changes that largely reflect a narrowing of scope between the time that you completed that part one of the application and the time we spoke to you in May or in March of this year. But there weren't really big major changes in the overall plans for how MTW flexibility will be used. In an apt analogy that we heard in one of our interviews, you described part one of the application as the buffet, where you looked at everything available to you and you think that you wanted it all. And part two was more like looking at your plate after you visited the buffet and thinking about what you can actually take in and digest. So the plans reported during part two of the application were more tailored to what would best suit your goals, the needs of your tenants, and what you could feasibly accomplish. We also took a look at plans for using funding flexibility. That's one of the core components of MTW flexibility is being able to apply fungibility across four funding streams. So public housing operating funds, public housing capital funds, HCV HAP or your subsidy payment funds, and your HCV administrative fees. In part one of the MTW application survey, all of you who applied for MTW flexibility core were asked whether or not you would use MTW funding flexibility if you were designated an MTW agency. The results of that survey are displayed here just for the 33 treatment PHAs, so those who were given the opportunity to continue their application for PHA or MTW designation. The majority, 64%, intended to merge their funding streams, and another 18% thought that you would. Plans for using funding flexibility may be just within a single program type. So in other words, combining your HCV HAP and your admin fees to better administer the HCV program. However, during the interviews, at least one of you did specifically mention that you plan to use funding flexibility to allocate more money to your HCV programs to serve more households on the waiting list. Your plans for using funding flexibility did not really change all that much between completing the step one application and step two. However, more than half of you, 52%, either did not expect to use funding flexibility in the first year or didn't have a definite timeline for when you'd start using it. A few of you noted a desire to wait until after you implement your initial MTW related changes or were still unsure as to what funding flexibility would mean in practice and whether you would ever use it. Okay, and we're also joined today by some of the control group PHAs. In the spring of 2021, this year, we asked executive directors from the 10 control group PHAs and 2 of the treatment group PHAs that didn't move forward with part 2 of the application to complete a short online survey. So as a reminder, those control PHAs are not precluded from implementing any changes to their program or policies that are compliant with the 1937 Act, seeking approval from HUD to implement new policies, or from applying for future cohorts of MTW. Of the 8 PHAs that completed the survey, 4 indicated that they were currently undertaking or planned to undertake activities in support of the 3 statutory objectives, so improving cost effectiveness, increased self-sufficiency, and improved housing choice. 2 control group PHAs have already begun efforts to increase their PHA's cost effectiveness by reorganizing staff responsibilities, making changes to their waitlist management, or shifting from annual to biennial inspections for HCV tenants. A third PHA is planning to increase its cost effectiveness by improving internal controls around voucher sizes. So to do that, the PHA is auditing their tenant files once a month to look for tenants who have had a decrease in household size, but no corresponding reduction in their subsidies supported unit size. Another PHA is seeking approval to begin participating in RAD to gain access to more stable funding sources. And finally, one PHA hopes to increase choice by conducting more landlord outreach, including reaching out to some of the larger apartment complexes in their area to negotiate rents that would be affordable to voucher holders. All right. So now I'm going to pass it over to Judy Geyer to discuss the evaluation's outcome measures.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you to all of the attendees. Thanks for following along so far. And when I finish talking about the outcome measures, we're going to turn this to you, and we have a poll for all of the attendees. So please stay tuned a little bit more. One of the goals of our baseline report this year was to present the outcome measures that will be used to estimate the impact of MTW designation. So our report defines these outcome measures. It presents the data for the values of these measures as of December 2020. We call these data our baseline measures because December 2020 is just before any PHA received MTW designation. The annual reports are going to present impacts on over 30 outcome measures, drawing from the 6 data sources that Larry cited earlier. Together with HUD, we worked to pre-specify one outcome measure as being the most encompassing for each statutory objective. The 3 outcomes on this slide are the ones designated as confirmatory, or the main outcome for each statutory objective. The main or confirmatory outcome for cost effectiveness is total operating and administrative expenditures per household per month. For the Housing Choice Voucher Program, this includes operating expenditures and housing assistance payments. For public housing, this includes operating expenditures minus utilities. In future years, we'll also include operating expenditures and housing assistance payments for households in local non-traditional programs of MTW agencies. For this year, we also exclude CARES Act funding. The mean operating administrative expenditure per household per month was $644. Okay, next objective. For self-sufficiency, the evaluation's main focus will be whether the treatment group PHAs have higher average household earnings. We define household earnings as the sum of the most recent 4 quarters of earnings from, not from PIC records, but from the National Directory of New Hires. So this group, the group of PHA clients will include in this are adults age 18 through 61 who do not have a disability and who reside in the PHA as of December 31st of the calendar year of interest. So we'll exclude adults and households who exited the program before December 31st of that year. As a baseline measure, we found the mean household earnings was around $14,000. Finally, for the 3rd statutory objective of housing choice, the main impact of interest is the impact on the percentage of voucher households living in low poverty census tracts. Okay, next slide, please, Tanya. Okay, in the next 3 slides, I'll present some of the additional outcome measures that we will use to explore each statutory objective. So you'll see the main outcome that I already introduced is being called confirmatory. So I'll just quickly talk through some of the exploratories. All of the cost effectiveness measures are measured per household per month. The first 3 are about expenditures, so public housing expenditures alone, housing choice voucher expenditures, and also housing assistance payments expenditures. And then we look at some measures of funding. So in particular, federal funding per household per month, also total revenue and cash reserves. Note that the average federal funding per household per month is slightly lower than total operating and administrative expenditures per household per month, but total revenue is higher than total operating expenditures. The data sources for these measures are HUD's financial data schedule. So they come from annual reports from PHAs, as well as HUD's voucher management system. Okay, next slide, please, on self-sufficiency. Our analysis of impacts on self-sufficiency will focus on adults in non-elderly, non-disabled households. All of the measures focus on earnings. I've already introduced the confirmatory one on a previous slide, but they focus, all of these measures focus on earnings alone, not income, assets, or human capital measures, for example, attending school. We chose to limit the analysis to earnings because work is the main goal of the statutory objective. The data source for all of these outcomes is the National Directory of New Hires because it provides quarterly wage information, so it's more up to date than PIC records. We can see from the sampling of exploratory measures that roughly 61% of non-elderly, non-disabled households are engaged in the labor force, at least as of December 2020. Next slide, please, for the housing choice outcomes. This slide looks really busy. Our review of the literature indicates that MTW PHAs have interpreted housing choice as an objective very broadly. So respecting that, we want to examine it, the three different facets of housing choice. Access to opportunity neighborhoods is the first one. The second is supply of affordable housing, and the third is assistance to hard-to-house populations. In this presentation, we just show a sample of outcomes within each of these three domains. The baseline report contains all of them. If you'd like to take a peek, I think it will be published later this fall. The main measure, which I've described, is the percent of HCV households living in low poverty census tracts. That falls under the opportunity neighborhoods domain. Some of the others in there are the percent of HCV households with children living in low poverty census tracts, as well as the percentage of public housing households with children living in low poverty census tracts. Some examples of affordable housing. One is the HCV unit utilization rate, which you can see is just under 90% at baseline, as well as the number of unique landlords per 100 voucher households, which across the 31 treatment PHAs was roughly 35%. We also examine hard to house population levels. The percentage of households that served a non-elderly family member with a disability is 30% at baseline. And at baseline, about 5% of the new admissions in the year 2020 were for households that were homeless at the time of admission. Okay, next slide, please. So I've talked about the three outcomes related to the three statutory objectives. There are some outcomes of interest that don't really fall into any of those three objectives, but they're important measures of housing programs to track, at least in the MTW expansion, including measures of households served, like and measures of household exit rates and rent burden. As expected, the vast majority, roughly 90%, of newly admitted households have income at or below the threshold of 30% area median income or the federal poverty rate. I find it interesting that roughly 11% of households ended their participation in the past 12 months. Rent burden is around 30% as expected, though slightly higher owing to some households who pay minimum rents. There's a few more outcomes of interest that you can review in the full report. Okay, I'll turn it back to Tanya to talk about the evaluation's next steps.
Thanks, Judy. Okay. So our next round of outreach will begin next year for our flexibility cohort PHAs. We will host another webinar in January to talk about our data collection plans for the year. And during that webinar, we'll also include a peer learning session. We'll begin our next round of interviews with each of the 31 MTW designated PHAs in February through March of 2022. During those interviews, we'll ask you about topics related to startup and implementation, such as what activities and waivers your PHA has implemented, how you decided which to implement and how, and your experiences implementing MTW at your agency. And that might include any challenges you may have experienced this year related to your PHA operations, staffing, or relations with tenants and stakeholders. We'll hold another webinar similar to this one in August of 2022, where we'll go over our report findings for year one, and all PHAs will be invited to attend that webinar as well. Our next round of data collection for the control group PHAs will not start until 2023. So we'll host another webinar in January 2023 to detail our data collection efforts for that year, and then field another online survey to ask about what activities you either have or plan to implement related to the 3 statutory objectives. And then, of course, we'll do another briefing in August of 2023 to talk about our findings for that year as well. Okay, so I'm now going to open it up to the poll. So in a second, you should see a poll screen open up at the bottom of your screen. Please take a moment to read through those questions. There's 5 questions. You might need to scroll a little bit. We're most interested in just hearing your perspective on what you'd be most interested in learning about from your peers. So the poll should have opened up in the bottom of your screen. Please go ahead and start that. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, we're also going to open it up to questions. So you can either take yourself off mute and ask a question, or type your question into the chat box. Once you're done with the poll, please make sure you scroll down to the bottom and hit the submit button so that we can tally all the responses and plan our peer learning for this January. Okay, great. So I'm just going to open it up to questions. Again, everyone was muted on entry, so if you do have a question and are on the line, please feel free to take yourself off mute to ask any questions you have about the evaluation, about our data collection for this baseline year, or plans for the future, or anything you heard about today. You can also just enter it into the chat. Yeah, we can send around a copy of the PowerPoint following the presentation. It looks like most of you have finished the poll. If you have any questions, again, please feel free to take yourself off mute or just type them into the chat. We'll give it a few more minutes. It looks like there are still a couple of people still completing the poll, so don't want to divide your attentions too much. Okay. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I just wanted to put up our contacts for the study team. If you have any questions after the webinar or something occurs to you later that you wish you to ask, you can always reach out to Larry Buron, who's our project director for the evaluation here at Apt Associates, or our contract representative, Ann Fletcher at HUD PD&R. Their phone numbers and email addresses are there on the screen, and they'll be in the copy of the PowerPoint that I circulate. And if you have any questions related to MTW, you can go ahead and contact the program office directly at that email address, MTW cohort1 at hud.gov. All right, and otherwise, thank you all so much for joining us today, and thank you again for all of your participation in the data collection this past spring. We really appreciate all of your efforts to support our evaluation.
Thank you, everybody.